power say in 1 minute. 1 minute.
Okay, so while we're waiting for this to turn on, I will like to speak to you today about thought forms Annie Besant, whom I adore, mad science, love, and politics. The day before yesterday, with my students at Northwestern University, we created a new website. It's called http://AnnieBesant-Gertrudestein-Weebly.com. It's on Weebly. For this purpose, it doesn't matter. Whenever it comes on, it comes on. It just means it doesn't want to come on. So it's okay. It's okay. It will come on. In the meantime, in this website that we just created with my students 2 days ago, there is a section called About. And in the section called About, we wrote, Annie Besant was born in 1847. Gertrude Stein was born in 1874. That is interesting, and it is interesting us. Gertrude Stein studied under William James and invented modernism. She saw how objects were experienced, and she liked looking at oil paintings. Annie Besant studied under Madame Blavatsky and saw thought forms as embodied and usually invisible objects, and she invented modernism. This is a reasonable reason for opening this website. Today, October 28, 2015, a group of Northwestern University students from the Art Theory and Practice Department, whose names are Sara Milkes Espinosa, Erin Hayden, Kaylee McPhee, and Dan Miller, together with Professor Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev, create this website for the purpose of furthering the study of the relations between Annie Besant and Gertrude Stein. This is done for the purpose of establishing relations between their times and ours, and understanding modernisms differently. This is done for the purpose of clearly finding a purpose for us in the cosmos, and as earthbound creatures, and as social beings who try to answer the question of how to live. There are many problems we think about, and we think about them through Gertrude Stein and Annie Besant. That's the end of the About section of the website. One of those problems we think about is love. I would like to be Annie Besant for today and act as her medium for you. What would she say today about love, she who so much loved? Just the other day, one of those students showed me a video lecture by Slavoj Žižek, where he argued that in the internet age there is a fear and an avoidance, not of love, but of the shattering and revolutionary experience of falling in love, an avoidance of the falling in part, through, for instance, online dating websites providing good matches for us, thus avoiding the risks of falling. Falling can hurt. Because our times are characterized by expulsion, as Saskia Sassen writes in her new book, Expulsions, expulsion from citizenship, expelled from a country like a refugee, expelled from one's own social contract in jail. The plants and the water on the planet itself are expelled from the biosphere in the Anthropocene and environmental crises we experience. This fear of falling is all the more strong and has turned into a fear of falling out rather than of falling in. So all falling is carefully avoided. In the same video, Žižek also sees the violence. No, put Annie Besant. Thank you. Yeah, that's Annie. In the same video, Žižek also sees the violence in Christian love and in all religious definitions of love. This reminds me also of the philosopher Alain Badiou, who 10 years ago defined the 20th century as a century during which humans loved so much humans, that they wanted to transform them into perfect humans, and thus they destroyed so many of them along the way through fascist regimes or so-called communist ones that were not communist at all. All close to forms of intransigent religious modern forms of religious love. Love is still a mystery, Vittorio, even though neuroscience has attempted in recent years to decode it through fMRI scans of people's brains while they look at images of other people, for example, to study love at first sight. Generally, these perspectives are utilitarian and see love as fundamentally no more nor less than an ability of the brain to quickly identify people who may be good matches for us. Good meaning compatible and thus useful for the survival of our genes. Now, theosophy in the 19th century would not suggest such an approach, and neither would physics today, especially quantum physics. And I believe quantum is indeed rather theosophical. Now, Annie Wood, her name Besant came by marriage. She soon divorced from her conservative husband and went on to a life of travels, writings, and becoming one of the most revolutionary forces to inspire our times, although not too often recognized for it, once stated, quote, "Better remain silent, better not even think if you are not prepared to act," unquote. For her, thought had practical effects on life. Quote, "Thought is just not something objective in our heads. Thought is power, real objective power. Moreover, the thoughts we create have a life of their own. They have a kind of material reality that affects other people for good or ill, hence our responsibility to choose," unquote. She chose. She first became a socialist member of the Fabian Society, then of the Marxist Social Democratic Federation, and a feminist who supported birth control and went to jail for that. She believed the working classes could never be free if they could not choose how many children to have, for example. And she fought against state religion and in favor of Irish home rule and for the rights of the urban poor. And in Wikipedia, we also read, quote, "Unemployment was a central issue of the time, and in 1887, some of the London unemployed started to hold protests in Trafalgar Square. Besant agreed to appear as a speaker at a meeting on November 13th. The police tried to stop the assembly, fighting broke out, and troops were called. Many were hurt, one man died, and hundreds were arrested. Besant offered herself for arrest, an offer disregarded by the police. The events created a great sensation and became known as Bloody Sunday. Besant was widely blamed or credited for Bloody Sunday. She went on, however, to be arrested at least twice during her London life. Because Besant felt something fundamental was missing in the materialistic, economic, and social theories of socialism, she left socialism and joined the Theosophists in 1889 or 1890, accounts diverge. Spiritualists who studied the religions comparatively and believed in the equality of all people irrespective of race, religion, and ethnicity. They also believed in the need to study science for the purpose of understanding and caring for nature, and they were amongst the first environmentalists we know of. She first visited India in 1898 and later lived in Diğer, India, and she was the first woman to be accepted into the Indian National Congress, actually leading it in 1917, and thus was extremely influential in the development of anti-colonial movements and of Gandhi himself. She said, famously, quote, "India demands home rule for two reasons. One essential and vital, the other less important but necessary. Firstly, because freedom is the birthright of every nation. Secondly, because her most important interests are now made subservient to the interests of the British Empire without her consent, and her resources are not utilized for her greatest needs," unquote. Today we've been speaking mostly about the other side of Annie Besant, the side of the thought forms, 1905. And indeed, it is one of the first examples of modern abstract art theory, although it was not claimed to be so. Indeed, the thought forms are, as we heard many times today, embodied entities of both the real world and the imaginal realm. They are visible and vibrating manifestations of what is generally invisible, and they can be apprehended in intense states of awareness, meditation, affect, and desire. Art, however, cannot represent these thought forms adequately. It always fails, and she knew it. And it is this failure of the adherence between the experience of them and their representation that lies at the core of art, of what we call art, as well as at the core of love. Indeed, as a prologue note to the book, she wrote about those images painted by her friends, the artists. And she wrote, quote, "The text of this little book is the joint work of Mr. Leadbeater and myself. Some of it has already appeared as an article in Lucifer, but the greater part of it is new. The drawing and painting of the thought forms observed by Mr. Leadbeater or by myself or by both of us together has been done by three friends, Mr. John Varley, Mr. Prince, and Miss McFarlane, as our friend today told us, to each of whom we tender our cordial thanks. To paint in earth's dull colors the forms clothed in the living light of other worlds is a hard and thankless task. So much the more gratitude is due to those who have attempted it. They needed colored fire and had only ground earths. It is our earnest hope, as it is our belief, that this little book will serve as a striking moral lesson to every reader, making him realize the nature and power of his thoughts, acting as a stimulus to the noble, a curb on the base. With this belief and hope, we send this little book on its way. Full stop, Annie Besant." Now, I am interested in theosophy today because it is so obsolete, and because it provides, indeed, an alternative to materialistic worldviews by not neglecting, however, the spiritual energies within us. Now, I was going to read to you all about the different invisible worlds according to theosophy, the various grades of rarefied matter or energy, the astral plane and the mental plane, but we have heard about them today. I remind you, however, that we generate three forces every day of our lives: thought, emotion, and action. The most powerful of these three is not action, but thought. Thought is the origin of action and controls emotion. It is as powerful a force as electricity, she would have said. Like all the forms of energy, thought can be used for both good and ill, just as electricity can be used to improve the quality of life or to destroy it. Since the action of every force has an equal and opposite reaction, and since thought is a power we all control to some degree, it is important to know just what thought is and how it can be used effectively. According to her, thought was an energy that is produced to modify the subtle matter of the mental energy field or plane. When we think, we cause our mental body to vibrate in certain ways, and those vibrations are passed on to the surrounding matter or the mental worlds. Those vibrations create those thought forms and shapes in the mental energy field whose colors, shapes, definitiveness of form, and persistence correspond to the quality, type, clarity, and intensity of the thought that produced them. Thoughts are things, she would have said. So I'm going to skip all the things about theosophical thoughts, since we have had them beautifully described, and go to the connection with the now. Now, theories of thought forms seem utterly anti-scientific, certainly naive to those who apply scientific methods to large bodies of matter, such as brains. And yet, when I do speak with quantum physicists, we immediately reach the problem of what Einstein called, quote, spooky action at a distance, unquote, in the early 20th century, and what we today call, quote, entanglement, unquote. Niels Bohr and other physicists of Einstein's time noted in thought experiments the force of entanglement, which went against all theories of the time because it suggested that something like information could travel faster than light, so that particles distant from each other would react connectedly. John Bell contributed with his Bell inequality theorem in the 1960s. Now we're into the mad science part of the talk. Anton Zellinger and his team in Vienna over the last 20 years, and I have been there and I have seen this, have proven in the lab and also with their noted Canary Island tests, connecting entangled situations on two islands that are very far from each other, that these thought experiments actually happened in the physical world. Last week in Nature magazine, Ronald Hansen of the University of Delft described his experiments that prove that the so-called hidden variable signaling, the only possible explanation Einstein suggested for the fact that two subatomic particles or even two larger elements such as photons, once entangled, will react concertedly, relatedly, even if they are on opposite sides of the planet or the universe, forever, unless disentangled, does not exist. So Einstein thought there must be something we don't know yet, some hidden variable that makes this strange, spooky action at a distance occur. But the experiments of last week, published last week in Nature in Delft, show that there is no hidden transmission of information from one to the other, that we might see. There is no hidden transmission of information that we might see in the future. No hidden SMS or email between them. Basically, we either accept that the physical world runs fundamentally on love, if we call entanglement another name for love, or we must believe in a predetermined universe that unfolds inevitably, some God. And I prefer to engage in the first hypothesis, as did Annie Besant. Now, we use this word to describe many different things. We use this word to describe both romantic love, which is connected but not equated with desire, and agape, or selfless love, the great Buddhist compassion which requires no exchange of gifts, only a boundless giving to the world. The love of siblings for their parents or of a mother for her child sits somewhere in between. Neuroscience calls this kind of love as an impulse, or not only we call this kind of love, this Buddhist compassion, as an impulse to care for others, empathy. And we explain it also on the basis of great research done, and it's an honor to be speaking in front of Vittorio Gallese, in mirror neurons that are fired more or less in different people's brains when they feel in themselves the same effect that a stimulus provokes in another person. Seen subjected to that stimulus, whether painful or pleasurable. And when we feel empathy, we trigger also problem-solving thoughts and attempt to share those with others so that they may benefit from what our solutions would be for ourselves. This is where love, whether from a parent or from a political leader, can become, however, abusive and violent in that attempt to share our own solutions with others, since we feel empathetically for them. While love can therefore be violent and masqueraded as peaceful, the, quote, falling in, unquote, opens our core to the possibility of being shattered. It welcomes fragility and vulnerability, and thus it is quite close to the word courage, which comes from cœur in French, cuore, the Latin for the word heart. The laying bare of our hearts, open to being destroyed. All the power Annie Besant exerted was only an expression of this fragility and willingness to fall and to fail. Because we cannot access the real except via the imaginary and through the symbolic, Jacques Lacan would add, To attempt to access the real through the organic, the body, or through the technological, the imaginary, leads only to collective and personal psychosis. As Ed Atkins put it, one of the artists in the Biennial, there is a fundamental failure to do justice to what one is committed to. And I would add, this keeps us in a state of grace. Now, the word committed, let us go there, brings up another point I would like to make. It comes from cum mittere, to put together, to put with. In a recent text, philosopher and friend Judith Butler considered speech acts that do not wound, such as saying, quote, I love you, unquote, in relation to commitment and the performativity of language. Aside from the fact that performing such a speech act can be considered cliché, there is a certain amount of exposure a person accepts, putting him or herself in a state of vulnerability. The words are anonymous and trite, belonging to everyone and to no one, and yet we try to inflect them with a sense of uniqueness, and we do this by conjuring up the body, our body, while performing that speech act. In saying, quote, I love you, unquote, a certain I is installed in one of the most repeated phrases of the English language, a marketed phrase, one that belongs to no one and to anyone. One risks a full evaporation into an anonymous citationality. I speak as countless others have spoken, say the same words, and you are equally substitutable at such a moment. On the other hand, the citationality of the speech act offends our sense of singularity or even authenticity, if that is a value we have. On the other hand, it is precisely through the citationality of the speech act that the body emerges in a specifically linguistic form. I give some somatic feeling to you, or try to, when I say these words. And I want the words to carry that feeling from here to there, to find its destination with you and be received there, or even to alter who you are and what you feel. Even as the utterance is citational, it is also therefore transitive. Someone sometimes says, I love you, and we find them slightly mad or overwrought, and we recoil, step away, turn away. And of course, that can always happen to us. So there is a chance that our speech act will be refused. And when, and if it is, we are ourselves refused, and we feel that refusal in a bodily way, unquote. That's Judith Butler, not me. Only if the words, this is again back to me, only if the words conjured in the throat and the body can exit our body as sounds and enter into the other's body as vibrations of air in their ears, and from there activate other physical emotional spheres of their body, including their brains and arms and backs and legs and internal organs, can the speech act be performed. To say I love you is, through the strange logic of citationality and transitivity, to be located over here and over there, at risk of disappearing into anonymity and of being exposed in ways that sometimes seem impossible to bear. The utterance is thus a wager we make, but it is also a wager we become. There is therefore a slightly suicidal madness in saying something like that, as if part of our body were jettisoned out into thin air and may or may not find a home in a body. This madness is of the heart, the cuore, and of courage. And it is, if it is related to commitment, Butler continues, the wager is gone and a tie installed that pacifies the heart. Commitment indeed removes the, quote, falling in, unquote, part, like institutionalized constituted power, like when we commit to one religion or another. So Judith Butler, stuck at the word commitment, tried to transform the word commitment into a more open word when she wrote, quote, if one is committing one's love, one is not making the commitment once, as one sometimes does in a ceremony of public proclamation. If one only commits once, then the rest of life is dedicated to honoring the commitment that one has made. But then the commitment belongs to the past, and whatever desire and love and choice were bound up with that commitment of love are also understood as historic monuments to be safeguarded at all costs. But if commitment is to be alive, that is, if it is to belong to the present, then the only commitment one can make is to commit oneself again and again." Unquote. This was her solution. Differently from Butler, my question is therefore how to maintain a position of fragility of the performative speech act without commitment, and I see no reason why Butler needs to address commitment in relation to love. Let us indeed, for one moment, integrate another concept, that of trust. Lévinas, another philosopher's question, in his book Totalité and Infinity and Totality in English, concerns how subjectivity is constituted. When we encounter the face of the other, the visage of the other, which both connects us outside of ourselves and also marks the limit of our solitude, our impossibility of breaking into the self of another, we ask, says Lévinas, the fundamental question is always, please do not kill me. And in the act of grace, when the other's potential shattering violence or rejection does not occur, here the personal, the subject, is constituted for Lévinas. It is a subject who is not subjected to the other, subjectus, thrown under, jectus, to be thrown, but a subject in the act of grace, gratia, to be thankful. An instance of trust is gained. We encounter the visage of the other and trust that he or she will not kill us. Now, Butler argues for a process of continual commitment. I love you and I choose you again and again. I did not choose you only once, but I continued to choose you, and what there is of me and my speech is given to you again and again through this speech, act, declaration, vow, and promise, one that binds me to you only in the present, whatever that present happens to be. That means as well that one binds oneself to the process of becoming different as circumstances demand, which means that in all repetition there is unknowing, like the waves. That explains the whole thing about waves in this biennial, by the way. But what is this choosing dependent on? On what basis do we choose again and again, if every instant and every encounter is a new one with an unknown factor? If we do not know the other because we live a continuous renewal of the present, then we cannot choose what we do not know. We can only fall into it. And to allow ourselves to fall, to leap, we need to trust that there is no cliff below and that someone's body will catch us and carry us momentarily. Perhaps what we do is engage not in a continuous commitment, but in a journey of trust, like entangled subatomic particles knotted together, not in a deathly arrested state, but dancing across the universe, spooky action at a distance. And it is perhaps precisely in the sphere of trust that love for persons, romantic love, and love for people, social love, can be connected. The love in the polis, in the street, in the demonstration, and the love in the private, interpersonal sphere. Trust is actually the opposite of commitment, and yet it lies at the heart of committed speech and committed acts, when we trust that the words, I love you, will indeed reach the other after hovering as a thought form in the ether, neither you nor me, removing the self from the self, falling and floating outside of a spatially bound location in an expanded field and time. It is the field, indeed, where expulsion can miraculously transform into inclusion. That's it. Now, Professor Christov would like to know if you have any questions about thought forms and Annie Besant and love, and maybe Vittorio and Pietro would like to come up and answer any last moments of doubts, or Marcos is still there. Maybe Vittorio has something to add neuroscientifically about love.
I mean, I fully understand that you're not so puzzled about what the people in theosophy wrote about the possibility to transmit thought at a distance, particularly when you speak with quantum physicists. If you think about the machines that we are employing to produce those images of the brain with colorful maps that basically boil down to an attempt to pinpoint limited regions where the blood flow increases in relation to some cognitive or perceptual or motor task. So it's an indirect way of monitoring the activity of the neurons. How we do it? We practically put the brain into a very powerful magnetic field which orient the spin of the protons of the water molecule. Then we put some a wave of a certain radio frequency which tilts the spin of the protons, and on the basis of the different distribution of water, you have an image of the brain, a static image of the brain. To do the functional imaging, you employ the very same machinery, but exploiting the fact that hemoglobin, which is the oxygen carrier within our blood cells, behave differently in this huge magnetic field when it carries the oxygen or when it is deprived of oxygen. So, I mean, we are talking about the brain, neurons, monitoring within a magnetic field the different behavior of an oxygen carrier. So it's so far away that many people say, well, be humble, because it's so indirect that it's I had this kind of discussion with a friend of mine who was a great fan of the astral body. And my wife, who was a true materialist and a neuroscientist, was objecting, are you talking about astral body? Are you nuts? And I said, if you consider our technology narrated to someone in 100 years, it may sound as bizarre as theosophy sounds to our scientific ears.
Okay, I don't quite understand how it relates to what we just said, but I love you too.
No, you were talking about neuroscience and theosophy, so I'm not so upset.
Good. Wow. Do you have anything to add, Peter? No. Oh, okay. Can we bring this to...
I understood the last example more in the sense of if there are certain things like mobile phones, for instance, similar way, the way they function, a lot of it is not materially visible, but how our voice is transported from a device to, through various scientific means to arrive at a very distant place immaterially. It's something like we operate on we use a lot of means that, similar to the imaging of the brain, that carry with them very immaterial. Radio, for example, is another. So I think I just understood that example as being something like that these things are not so far from one another. But then I wanted to come back to your talk because you said a lot of different things that maybe you can elaborate on this question of the commitment and trust, because
the difference between them.
Yeah, because you said it in more passing, but I want you to talk about that more, because you're not quite sure why Judith Butler has to sort of find a way to affirm the commitment.
Well, she needs to take apart the institutionalized commitment, which is deathly, and to do that she speaks about
committing to commit,
committing to commit, and to constantly commit oneself, which is similar to in politics when one speaks of a kind of continuous revolutionary process which never is in constituted power, that people have spoken about a lot in recent years. It occurred to me to remove the problem of needing to unhinge and unsew together the word commitment, and rather turn it around. I mean, to commit is an action that goes from me outwards to outwards. So it's very, in a way, authoritarian and centered on the subject. Trust is somehow a removal of the subject I, and a reversed movement that one imagines. You know, one imagines a positive energy from some distant subject, some other subject, towards us. So it's a more vulnerable position than to commit. And because it is not dependent on our own choice to commit permanently or in the present, and because it reverses the authority from I outwards, it is by its nature fragile, vulnerable, constituent and not constituted. And because I believe that those thought forms, I believe that our thoughts can vibrate and emanate, and they can bring to catastrophic consequences, or through meditation or yoga or many other things, our thoughts, the negative thoughts, you know, the selfish affection, you can kind of see it and it's there and you move it away. Because of that, I think that it's very important to hover around certain thought forms rather than others. So why do the effort of taking apart commitment when you can just shift to the other thought form of trust, which of course may seem naive. You know, it's the Vita Sackville-West question, you know. I mean, is it naive to be in that position because then somebody puts a bomb and 120 people die in a square? Or is it actually in the long run, in a universal scope, in a cosmic scope, is it actually the right thing to do, you know, like Gandhi? Anyway, that's another political question.
No, I mean, precisely, it's a political question. That's why.
Yeah, but I don't know, you know, how do I know if it's naive and you know, bound to failure or not? But I do think that maybe trust is a good energy to put in play. You know, I remember talking about that with Etel, I think, Etel Adnan, that it's very much lacking right now in advanced capitalism, and when the religion of economy is the religion that we mostly ascribe to, with its churches and temples and vestals, and trust is not exactly high up on the stakes. Well, commitment certainly is. You know, you can commit to a lot of things in the financial systems and be very committed to them.
It's difficult because, you know, money has this, I don't know, is it like also in the sense of like in God we trust, you know, that there is also
Yes, you are right. In God we trust is a way of disempowering people, but that was also true in another historical moment when that was written, In God We Trust. And indeed, Marx had a point when he was saying, you know, religion is the opium of the people. But we have seen that the elimination of spirituality from people's lives did not bring to what was hoped for. It somehow didn't consider something quite fundamental in humans and maybe in other species too. And so there are a lot of people thinking about that failure also of the historical, let's say, materialistic thinking around.
Although spirituality and religion are two different things.
Yes, of course. One is constituted and one is inner.
So
Yeah,
what exactly are we trusting?
No, we're not always trusting, but I'm saying trust is a good thing to start to have. Well, one can trust another person. One can trust that a child isn't going to go, you know, kill themselves, and so we don't have to put in their cell phones some program to control where they are, some tracking device that's being sold now to control where your daughter is going to be, you know, tonight, and so forth. It's trusting others, trusting they won't kill us.
I think we have a problem with language, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, trust technology. You don't trust technology, but people may tell you you should trust technology. So, but I'm not sure that when we trust technology, we perform the same, we produce the same thought form as when I trust my child.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. Like the word love is very much a floating signifier. The word trust can also be, all words can be floating signifiers. So each of us, whether it's Judith Butler one day or myself one day, it's an act of poetic speech performativity to stop on a certain word and dance with it for the time of one lecture. But obviously, most words of any importance are floating signifiers.
Yeah.
Of course.
There's a question.
Ben Vickers.
Hi. I think that you've been hovering around kind of answering this question, but I wanted to ask it kind of specifically, because I agree in terms of this difference between commitment and trust. And I think it's particularly interesting in this moment to almost like make a call for moving away from commitment, given that, say, the contract is like the kind of personification of a commitment. And in a moment in which technologies, platforms, the troika, anything of this nature is defined through a kind of contract. Therefore, these contracts, there's a lot of kind of social infrastructure and conditions around making that the kind of world that we live in. And so I wondered, given that those are the kind of predominant forms through which we interact with one another, what would the conditions or the kinds of infrastructure or the ways of being in the world be in order to kind of accelerate or increase trust as a kind of basic way of interacting with one another? Because it feels that the world is constructed in such a way that this is not the default, the contract is the default.
Yes. Well, I think what you do on Monastery is a technique for that, or I think what Renee and Irene do in Rantink, for example, space, is a technique for trust building. So those are two examples, I suppose.
I agree, and maybe one thing that I would add to that is that I think that it's interesting the trust in God comes up, because that is the kind of natural route for this. When you kind of, spirituality and religion gave that space in order to be able to trust. But it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, but
now.
words change meaning. You know, revolution became Nike shoes for a while, and so they change meaning. That's why it's interesting to bring Annie Besant today, because we see what words she used, what words we use, how we can talk to each other. It's like a form of translation or teleportation through time, and it fragilizes our own use of words and fragilizes her use of words. So in her, you know, I don't know if she used the word trust. It just occurred to me yesterday to use that word, but for example, I trusted Pietro. I trusted he would do a really great lecture. Now, so some people call it intuition. You know, some people say Carolyn uses intuition to build her exhibitions or to do her projects. But is it intuition or is it trust, you know? So sometimes the world doesn't exist until you trust the world, and then it enters into the world. You know, it's what Donna Haraway would call worlding. Things A doesn't exist and B exists, and then they interact. But A and B come into the world together, interacting, which is the Karen Barad version of the Donna Haraway statement around worlding. So if the biennial can be in any way a kind of example or prototype of worlding, that would be one way of looking at it. You know, a series of acts of trust, which are these leaps, you know, that you hope there's going to be someone there under the cliff to hold you. I think most people use the word intuition today for this same thing. But intuition, again, is very, somehow from psychoanalysis of language, it's a little bit a term that again is the subject folding onto itself, you know. It's a very narcissistic word, intuire, to see inside.
Maybe the last thing I'll add, because I think there's a question. But
we have to end apparently in 3 minutes or
okay,
2
3
minutes.
minutes. I was just going to say the phrase that we use in our monastery is trust in the process.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
There was a question here.
Actually, not a question, but
a comment.
sharing a comment.
Sure.
While I was listening to you, I just kind of felt connected. Not committed, but connected. And the word you use, the heart, you know, the Latin word for courage.
Mm-hmm.
So I interpreted trust, your concept of trust, as no fear. You know, brave, courageous, and fall.
Yeah, fall. Yeah, if you want to use that word. But qual è la origine etimologica di fear? Non viene dal latino come ferocia, no? E deve essere una cosa anglosassone, I mean germanica. Right. I think it's a Germanic etymology. I usually go towards Latin etymologies because I spend most of my life in the Mediterranean, I guess.
Courageous or being from the heart is maybe heart of trust.
Yeah, but these words change. I mean, we just play with words. We dance with words over time. And the more they change and dance, the more we let them free, you know. That's why there's a double, for example, this United Nations laws to protect immaterial culture, such as languages and songs and so on. It's very tricky. I mean, I've had some interesting debates and discussions around that, because to freeze immaterial culture is also very dangerous in a way. So, but at the same time, they're devastated. They are expelled. I mean, one word that I wanted to bring in today was expulsion, you know, which I take from Saskia's new book, Saskia Sassen's new book. I mean, it's true that languages are expelled and words are expelled. So there has to be some form of resistance to the expulsion as well. Va bene così? So